In January of 2007, the Core 2 Quad Q6600 had its initial release. So 14 years on, how does this once legendary CPU that cost nearly $1,000 on its initial release perform today? Stay tuned to find out. The Q6600 had its initial release in January of 2007 at the eye-watering price of $851 which is $1,069.07 today as of the time of researching. This specific Q6600 is a slightly newer revision released in July of that same year. This had some minor bug fixes and lower power consumption than the original version released earlier, and it also came in at a far more reasonable price of $266, which is $344.16 today as of the time of researching. It was a 2.4 GHz quad-core CPU for Intel's 775 socket. It was based on the Kentsfield architecture and was built on the 65nm fabrication process, featuring 585 million transistors. The interesting thing with Core 2 Quads though is that they are essentially two Core 2 duos stuck together, as the 4 cores are actually split between two separate chips on the processor. This affects the way the L2 cache is used, as although it technically has 8 MB, each dual-core chip only has access to 4 MB of it to share between the two cores. Each core itself also has access to its own L1 cache of 64 KB. And like the Core 2 duos, there is also support for DDR1, DDR2 and DDR3 RAM as well. And for the rest of the system that we're going to be using for benchmarking the Q6600 today, we're using our usual Socket 775 testing system, and this features a Gigabyte GA EP45 DS3L motherboard, as well as 8GB of DDR2 RAM running at 800 MHz with timings of CL55515. Graphics card wise, we're using a MSI GTX 1080 Armorel C Edition graphics card from my personal system to eliminate any potential bottlenecks. Cooling wise, we're using a Phanteks TC14PE cooler. Windows 10 Pro is our choice for operating system, and we're also running the non-gaming benchmarks from an SSD. Also running Windows and the non-gaming benchmarks from an SSD, with the games themselves running from a mechanical hard drive. For the benchmarks today, we're also going to be doing some overclocked testing in the games and non-gaming focused benchmarks as well. Now, for the overclock, we managed a max stable speed of 3.6 GHz, which is 50% over the standard 2.4 GHz. This is an increase in clock speed which is pretty much unheard of these days. This required a voltage increase to 1.44 volts for the V-core, and we also had to increase the CPU termination voltage to 1.28 volts for stability. One thing I would also like to add is just how scary the increased power draw is, or was, during stability testing for the overclock. I use Intel Burn Test to test clock stability before I run any tests on it. And with this, with the 3.6 GHz overclock at the voltages I mentioned, we were actually seeing power draw in excess of 200 watts, which is more than even the Ryzen 7 2700 at 4 GHz in my personal system pools. The actual cables from the power supply supplying power to the CPU were actually getting warm to the touch because of the amount of power running through them. That aside, let's fire into the benchmarks. We are kicking off testing with GTA 5, still a highly popular game today. 1080p with the lowest settings in DirectX 11 mode proves a bit of a challenge for the now 14-year-old Core 2 Quad Q6600. Frame times are noticeably inconsistent throughout, which you see represented in-game as micro-stuttering. FPS is generally in the mid-30s to low 40s, however it doesn't quite look like that due to the stuttering. You will end up noticing slight hitches as well, which are represented in the frame times as spikes of around 32 to 43 milliseconds throughout that points, as well as spikes of up to 52 milliseconds and some up to 70 milliseconds as well. Stock clocks managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 42.9, 26.9 and 22.6 FPS respectively. The overclock shows an improvement to 53.4, 34 and 28.3 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Gameplay itself is also improved. However, you will still notice some hitches throughout, mostly in the desert area around where Trevor lives, as well as some slight but noticeable micro-stuttering throughout the map. It is by no means unplayable, far from it actually, but with spikes in frame times of around 24 to 42 milliseconds throughout, and a few in the 63 to 98 millisecond region, you are still going to notice the stuttering. 2016's Doom doesn't run perfectly. Generally, I'd recommend sticking to Vulkan only if you have a graphics card capable of it, and for that reason I will only be talking about performance in Vulkan. 1080p with the lowest settings are being used here. I am also having to use the +jobs_numthreads4 command in the game's launch settings within Steam, as without it, the game can take far longer to load. There is a slight but noticeable amount of micro-stuttering throughout the mission, as well as some occasional hitches too. These are represented by spikes in frame times of around 15 to 41 milliseconds throughout the mission, and more in the 50 to 62 milliseconds range as well. It's not until the final part of the UEC mission, which I use for benchmarking Doom, that you start to really notice the stutter. It's made more noticeable by the sheer difference in performance in that part of the map compared to the rest of the mission. This is massively improved upon with the overclock, where even the last part of the mission runs relatively well. The game still has some minor micro-stuttering, which you have to really be looking for to actually notice it, although you will probably pick it up when turning the camera around in places. You will still get spikes in frame times of around 17 to 43 milliseconds as well, but overall performance has improved a lot. Stock clocks managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 67.5, 35.1 and 25.5 FPS respectively, which saw a boost to 85, 47.3 and 34.8 FPS respectively with the overclock. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, and for this I'm running the game's inbuilt benchmark, so performance here may vary compared to actual in-game performance. This is also being run at 1080p with the lowest settings in DirectX 11. This one has noticeable micro-stuttering throughout all three benchmark scenes, with the most severe spikes in frame times coming in the second scene, which takes place in the jungle. The third scene also takes an age to actually load, and has some slight texture pop-in on the mountain you see when it first starts. We're looking at spikes in frame times of around 24 to 63 milliseconds throughout the benchmark, with more throughout of around 63 to 134 milliseconds. Stock clocks managed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 34.6, 14.8 and 8.2 FPS respectively. Performance does improve noticeably with the overclock, with figures of 41.6, 21.5 and 16.1 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. There is still a noticeable amount of micro-stuttering throughout, however it is far reduced over stock. There are far less severe spikes in frame times throughout as well, with some remaining spikes throughout of around 22 to 59 milliseconds, and some more reaching up to around the 96 millisecond mark. Third benchmark scene even loads much faster now too. CSGO today is a far harder game to run than it was upon its initial release in 2012. This is shown by the problems the Q6600 has running it in 2021. 1080p with the lowest settings is being used here. I've also left texture streaming enabled, Uber shaders on auto, which default to enabled anyway, and anisotropic filtering on 16x. Boost player contrast has been disabled here. Benchmark, for which I'm using a competitive bot match on the Mirage map, shows noticeable micro-stuttering throughout. The game generally stays above 60 FPS, but could drop into the low 40s. Even at the upper range though, stuttering is still quite noticeable. This is caused by the frame times being very inconsistent. We saw spikes of around 18 to 35 milliseconds throughout, more of around 37 to 64 milliseconds, and multiple as high as 110 to 154 milliseconds throughout the test. Average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates at stock clocks are 80.4, 34.9 and 17 FPS respectively. The 17 FPS 0.1% low, indicating the severity of the stuttering we saw. Overclocking boosts the performance substantially, although it can't fix all of the problems, only make them less noticeable. While it does indeed perform far better than stock clocks, there is still a noticeable amount of microstutter, which is mostly noticeable when turning the camera. Even though we're now seeing average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 127.9, 58.5 and 30.4 FPS respectively, we are still getting spikes in frame times throughout of around 15 to 67 milliseconds, and more around the 88 to 107 millisecond mark as well. Lastly, before we move on to the non-gaming benchmarks, it's Crysis, specifically the original Crysis, which released back in 2007, the same year as the Q6600. 1080p with the lowest settings in 64-bit DirectX 10 mode is being used. This is a game developed in a time when Intel claims the future of computer processors were single or dual core CPUs running at 10 GHz, so it is a game well known for only making use of a maximum of 2 cores, but it is still a fun game to test. Quad-core Q6600 also has the advantage of being able to, theoretically at least, dedicate 2 cores entirely to running the game without having to bother also running the operating system and background processes on them too, unlike a dual-core CPU which has to run the game, the operating system and any background processes on the same 2 cores. So you should see better performance from the quad-core over an equivalent core to dual, despite Crysis, as I mentioned, only making use of 2 cores. To start with, the game seems to run reasonably smooth, although you may notice some slight micro-stutter if you turn the camera around and look at your surroundings. The relative smoothness of the game only lasts up until after you run to save Aztec. From then onwards you can notice a fair amount of micro-stutter, which gets noticeably worse on the run-up towards the buildings you come across on your way to the Luzcaz Call area, after you leave the North Korean command post. This is where we notice a fair amount of stop-start stuttering, which you see represented in the frame times as spikes of around 128 to 168 milliseconds every few seconds for a period of roughly 50 to 60 seconds. Another issue we notice is that there are problems with textures and objects taking quite a while to pop in. This is minor at first, but gets progressively worse as you move through the island mission I use for benchmarking Crysis. The game is playable despite these issues, although with spikes in frame times throughout of around 14 to 114 milliseconds and a few more beyond that, you are going to notice the stutter. The overclock does improve performance massively, as you get an idea of from the massively increased benchmark figures on screen now, but the issues are still there. The game runs quite smoothly up until you're asked to use the binoculars for the first time, other than a few minor hitches. The stop-start stuttering after you leave the North Korean command post is still there, albeit less severe in terms of frame times. And the game still has some noticeable micro-stutter, again far less severe than stock, which is particularly noticeable when turning the camera at times. Kicking off the non-gaming benchmarks is Cinebench R23. This is a multi-threaded benchmark based on Maxon's Cinema 4D software. It isn't particularly widely used, with most people using Blender instead, but it is a benchmark that I like running anyway, running both the multi and single thread tests 3 times and averaging the respective scores to get the final score for each test. And at stock clocks, the Q6600 manages 1,253 points, which puts it 3.76% down on what the newer dual-core hyper-threaded 1st Gen Core i3 550 managed a few videos ago, while pulling 128.76% more power than the i3 did, 59.66 watts plus or minus 3% down the CPU power cable versus the i3's 26.08 watts. This shows just how much difference only a few years can have, as the i3 released in 2010. Single-threaded performance has the Q6600 sitting at only 329.33 points, significantly behind the i3 550's 502.33 points. This is an increase in performance of 52.53% for the 550 over the Q6600 in single-threaded performance, an increase pretty much unheard of these days. Overclocking boosts the scores for multi- and single-thread tests up to 1,881.67 and 492.67 points respectively, increases of 50.17 and 49.6% respectively. The multi-threaded score is now higher than the 550's overclocked score of 1,756.67 points, 7.12% to be exact, showing that the two extra physical cores of the Q6600 are just about enough to make up the gap in per-core performance, although the Q6600 does this while pulling a whole 115.87% more power than at stock, and 133.15% over what the overclocked i3 550 pulls at 55.24 watts, plus or minus 3% in the same test. The overclock helps the Q6600 make up some of the deficit in single-threaded performance to the 550, whose overclocked score is now only 30.15% ahead of the Q6600's. Blender rendering is up next, and for this I use the Fishy Cat scene, which is freely available for download online. I run the test 3 times, rendering only a single frame each time. Take the time to render each frame from each test and average those times together to get the final score. And at stock clocks, the Q6600 manages to render the frame in 203.67 seconds, which is 22.53% down on what the i3 550 manages at stock. This score sees a decrease in time to render the frame of 30.66% while overclocked, down to 140.86 seconds. This is now 15% faster than the 550, although the overclocked 550 is 14.2% faster than the Q6600 once it's been overclocked itself. The 7-zip compression and decompression benchmarks are up next. For this I used the latest version of 7-zip, 19.00 at the time of testing, and used the built-in benchmark. I run the benchmark in blocks of 3, with each block consisting of 4 runs of the benchmark. I then take an average score in MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, from each block and average those scores together to get the final score, with a higher score being better. And at stock clocks, the Q6600 manages 8,824.33 MIPS, which sees a boost in score of 34.51% to 11,870 MIPS, while the stock score is 1.7% down on the stock clocked i3 550 at 8,978 MIPS. The overclocked Q6600 is 4.85% of the 11,321 MIPS score that the 550 managed while overclocked. Decompression is next up, and at stock clocks, the Q6600 scores 12,968.33 MIPS, almost 2,000 MIPS ahead of the 550. This sees a boost up to 19,248.67 MIPS, an increase in decompression performance of 48.43% over stock. This is also now roughly 4,600 MIPS, or 31.3% better performing than the i3 550 is. And to finish off the testing, we were looking at power draw at idle. If you want an idea of what sort of power the Q6600 pulls under full load, then you can go back and watch the Cinebench R23 benchmark part of the video. Stock clocks had the Q6600 pulling 20.24 watts, plus or minus 3% down the CPU power cable, while the overclock boosts us up by 119.86% to 44.5 watts, plus or minus 3%. This is a huge increase in power draw. Remember though, this is with all of the power savings disabled in the BIOS and the Windows power plan being set to high performance mode. So this figure will likely be at least a little bit lower with power savings enabled. So to conclude, it was quite interesting testing out the Q6600. It is one of the most popular CPUs of the modern era, and cost over $1,000 in today's money. In its day, almost nothing would use 4 cores, and it was often a toss-up of choosing a dual core running at a faster frequency, or going with this, hoping that software would catch up and utilise all 4 cores. It was nice finally getting my hands on one, and overall it was fun testing it out. I was particularly impressed with the overclocking capabilities. It managed 50% over the stock speed. It was also quite terrifying seeing just how much power this thing could pull when overclocked in torture tests like Intel Burn Test. It pulled over 200 watts, which is more than my Ryzen 7 2700 pulls in the same test while running at 4 GHz. Before we finish up, I'd like to give shoutouts to a couple of my Patreon supporters, Shadow in the Void and Matt Desterak, for helping to make all of this possible. If you would also like to become a patron, you can do so through patreon.com/benchytests, where from as little as $2 per month, you will gain early access to all of my videos 3 days before the public do for as long as you remain a patron. If you would prefer not to become a patron though, and would still like to donate in some way, you can do so through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/benchytests. Now, saying that, supporting me financially in any way, it is in no way, shape or form required at all. If it's something you want to do, I only want you to do so if you actually want to do it, not because you feel like you need to, and only if you are actually financially able to do so. Because just watching my videos is more than enough support. I make these videos for fun, so any money I make from them is of no consequence to me at all. I would still be making them if I wasn't getting anything at all. So yeah, please do not ever feel like you actually need to support me in any way other than just watching the video. Even if it's just on in the background while you work, that is fantastic. You're still consuming my content, and I still thank you for that. So yeah, thank you for watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you next time.